So, good evening everyone, and welcome to the Princeton Public Library. My name is Jamie Herman, and I am the manager of adult programming here at the library. It's my great pleasure to welcome everyone tonight to the community room, where we will be learning the backstory to how Sesame Street in the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, was brought to millions of children living in Russia. The Muppets were envisioned to be the ideal ambassadors of Western values, but no one could anticipate how this project would become challenging and dangerous. We are about to find out. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This room is equipped with a hearing loop that pairs with T-coil technology if you require hearing assistance. We kindly ask that you silence electronic devices during the talk and that you hold your questions, as there will be a chance for audience question and answer at the end of the presentation. A book signing will take place immediately following the conversation, and we have Labyrinth Books here with us on site to handle the sales. Thank you, Labyrinth. As hinted earlier in the introduction, this night's event, our speakers will be discussing Sesame Street, and in specific, the book Muppets in Moscow, with a subtitle of The Unexpected, Crazy, True Story of Making Sesame Street in Russia, and it was written by Natasha Lance Rogoff. This book recounts how, amidst bombings, assassinations, and a military takeover of the production office, Natasha Lance Rogoff and the talented Moscow team of artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, and puppeteers remain determined to bring laughter, learning, and a new way of seeing the world to children in Russia, Ukraine, and across the former Soviet Empire. It's more than just a story of a children's show. It's a book that provides a valuable perspective of Russia's people, their culture, and their complicated relationship with the West. And it remains relevant even to this day. Joining the author is Deborah Kaple of Princeton University. A little bit about our speakers. Natasha Rogoff is an award-winning American television producer, filmmaker, and journalist. She has done documentaries in Russia, Ukraine, and the former Soviet Union for NBC, ABC, and PBS. The book that we are here to learn about tonight, Muppets in Moscow, was a nominee for the 2023 Pushkin House Book Prize and received the Benjamin Franklin Independent Book Publishers Association for Best New Voice and Best Audiobook in Nonfiction, and the Independent Publishers Book Award for Best First Book. Deborah Kaple is a researcher, scholar, and lecturer at Princeton University. She has studied at Ohio State, George Washington, Princeton University, and Vermont College. She teaches a freshman seminar on the Cold War and a class titled Communism and Beyond, Russia and China. Her publications include Dream of a Red Factory, The Legacy of High Stalinism in China, and Gulag Boss, a Soviet memoir. So as you can see, Deborah has the perfect credentials to be here tonight interviewing Natasha. Welcome to both of you.
Welcome to Princeton.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jamie, for that lovely introduction, too.
So, these are a mess, as I told you.
Well, while you're getting organized, I'll just say, this is the first time I've been back in Princeton in about 28 years. And both of my children were born here. My husband taught at Princeton University for 8 years. And just before coming here, I was here this morning with a group called the Old Guards, about 120 amazing, brilliant people who get together, and they started their community assembly by singing the national anthem, which I probably also haven't heard for about 30 years. And so I walked over to the chapel, and I was married in the chapel here. So it's great to be back here, and thank you all for coming tonight, especially because it is so cold out there.
It would be fitting for Russia.
Yes.
So Natasha, I wanted to ask you, I guess, first, how did you actually get interested in Russia?
So I was always fascinated with the culture. I had, my grandfather left Russia, or Belarusia, in 1912. And so I knew that, there was this other place where our ancestors had come from. And then I found a lot of literature, children's fairy tales, and I loved them. I mean, they were very different. And then in high school started reading Russian literature, and of course the characters were so cruel and spiritual, at the same time. So I wanted to know more about this culture and started studying Russian at college. So my grandfather, of course, spoke Russian and Yiddish, and then my parents didn't. My siblings don't, but I do, and then went back to Russia, or went there for the first time at age 22 as there was an exchange program. We had 30 American students living in Moscow and 30 in St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad. And this was in the early 1980s, and an utterly fascinating experience under communism at that time.
Yeah, so I studied Russian at college, and then I went on an exchange program in 1974. So that was probably the middle of the Soviet Union, really towards the end. And I loved it there. I thought the people were very happy and they were nice to us. And even though I studied Russian, the teachers were scary. They taught us Russian really well.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so, well, I wanted to ask the audience first, how many people here have been to Russia? Well, that's a lot. And what about to Ukraine? And how many people know that Sesame Street had its own original Russian language program? A few. Well, since we're going to play the video, why don't we just start with that? Because I wanted to give you an idea of what the show looked like and what the Muppets looked like, and this is a great intro. So.
Is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Какое-то такое первое прочтение ребенка.
Our kids have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
You can see that there's a lot of similarities between what Russia was like then and still today in terms of a lot of the problems and the challenges that we had to deal with making this children's puppet show in the mid-1990s.
Except the only difference with the 1990s is the whole economy had fallen, the whole country had fallen. So I wanted to ask you, wasn't that daunting because there were no banks?
Yeah, there were no Western banks at the time, and I think what scared me the most about making this show was that I had no children's television experience when Sesame Street asked me to, lead the team, and then I also had a lot of assumptions, having lived in what was then the Soviet Union, that turned out to be wrong. After the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a period of, intense instability, violence. There was enormous feeling that ordinary Russians, Ukrainians, many people of the former Soviet Union felt humiliation at the loss of their superpower. And at the same time, it was a time of incredible hope, particularly for us in the West but also for many ordinary Russians, because they had lived under a repressive regime for so many years.
I wanted to ask you, what did you do for Sesame Street? You were doing something else, not working with children's programming.
Well, I was making documentaries in the Soviet Union, and the last one I made was called Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism, where I had embedded with conservative, hardline communists who were trying to prevent the Soviet Union from imploding. And it was at the screening of that film that the Sesame Street executives approached me. And of course I thought, you just watched my film. I don't understand why you're asking me to, help you with the Muppets. It's just not something I can understand. But I went down to the studios in New York, and they had, Big Bird on the Wall and Cookie Monster, and so many young people running around who were, incredibly earnest and, dedicated to changing the world. And I was really impressed. And also what they were trying to do in terms of, having the Muppets model values of an open society and provide skills for the next generation to learn and thrive in an open society. It was really ambitious. And on a personal level, I'd never led a production of that size, because I'd been doing documentary films, directing with a team of maybe 3 people. And this was an enormous project. And so I said yes, without understanding what was going to come next.
When the Soviet Union did collapse in 1991, didn't that give you pause? Before you went there, you knew that? Or were you already there?
No, I had finished the film, and then I left, and then Sesame Street approached then Senator Biden for congressional approval of funding a Russian version of Sesame Street. And then I didn't go back until '93. But it's really only a couple of years. And even in that time frame, quite a bit had changed. And even when one of the first people that we had to match the funding from the U.S. Congress because the legislators did not want to have the show appear to be an import, which it wasn't. It wasn't an imported show. It was going to be an original production. And by the time we finished, we had 400 artists working on the production. Puppeteers, producers, animators, filmmakers, writers. It was a huge team. And so in terms of the first part of my experience, and what I write about in the book as well, is what the business community was like. And this entailed meeting with new rising businessmen, oligarchs, entrepreneurs. One of my meetings was with as I'm talking about, the Muppets and Sesame Street and this philanthropic project that he could possibly be a sponsor of. And he had like a giant fish tank in his office with a shark, swimming. And then I went to we finally got a meeting with someone you may know as Boris Berezovsky, who later was a key advisor to Boris Yeltsin, who was the Russian president. And I was really kind of intimidated to meet him, but we met him in a restaurant. I was with my colleague, my Russian colleague, who was my business associate. And this oligarch had 2 strapping bodyguards with him. And we met them in a Japanese restaurant, where we were going to eat like pieces of fish, like, sushi. And all I could think about is, how much fish these guys would eat, to fill up. And it was expensive there too,
A lot of money.
Yeah. And then And then, he listened to us about what we were going to do and bring a lot of technology transfer and training of the TV professionals in media, because they didn't have that much experience in our type of television production. They used television primarily for propaganda, not for advertising. Advertising didn't exist until the Soviet Union fell. So we were quite sophisticated. Our shooting with 3 cameras, using sync sound, none of this was adopted in Soviet Russia and then immediately after. So then he asked me, he was kind of intrigued with this idea of training, because he was in the process of essentially buying half of Russia's largest TV station. And then he asked me, is Big Bird gonna be in the show? And I was like, I was afraid to answer, because Big Bird is not in the international co-productions. He stays in America, and then we build new Muppets for the local productions. And I said, no, Big Bird's not in the production, but we're gonna create these new 3 Muppets, which are gonna be based on your own culture and values. That's the whole idea of the show. And we're gonna build a new set, which is also based on your own values and aesthetics. So he agreed to finance the whole thing. And I went back to New York and met with my bosses, and I was thrilled. I thought, wow, we're done. Now they're gonna release the funding from the Congress. And 3 weeks later, I got a call from my business associate who told me that Boris's car, he had been blown up in a car bombing, and he was severely burned. And so we couldn't, basically the lawyers ghosted us, and there was no deal. So he eventually, went through treatment overseas and came back stronger than ever, but he had bigger problems to deal with and was no longer interested in sponsoring our children's television show. But what proceeded to happen after that is we then partnered with a broadcaster who was a really amazing man. This was Vlad Listyev, who was bringing press freedom to the country. And one night he was at the studio at the TV station, and he had been trying to shift some of the advertising money to production, because he didn't have enough money to pay for news and programming, because it was just getting eaten up by the middlemen as their own profit. So he went home one night, and he was just murdered in front of his house. And that was our next partner. And 9 months later, his replacement was also murdered. So that was the beginning of the process of making this show. And that's what they look like there. There's, Slavienko, he was so young and, recently divorced, and a couple of weeks before that, I had given him one of the early Tickle Me Elmo dolls when it came out for his daughter. But I think it was, there was a lot of violence, but it was also a lot what we faced, with the cultural clashes too, trying to make this show.
Plus problems with getting food, people not getting paid, just like the staff. So that was probably why you thought it would be a good idea, or your boss thought it was a good idea to find an oligarch. Because it seemed like the only people who had money were the oligarchs.
Well, we ended up finding a terrific partner who had her heart in the right place. And this was Irina Borisova, who had an 8-year-old daughter. And even though there were many problems with her, which we write about in the book, she was, an incredible person to work with. And she kept running out of money, or else she didn't have the money, because the Russian government would be freezing the bank accounts. But I think what was most fascinating about this were, what did they want their show to look like? What did they want the Muppets to look like? And that was an incredible multi-month debate.
You should talk about that. That's a really cool part of your story.
Okay, so we showed them the photographs and video of the American Muppets and then some of the international Muppets. And their first reaction was, those are really funny looking. And they don't look like our puppets. Then the head writer said, I don't think we're going to use those puppets. We have a 16-year, we have a puppetry tradition that dates back to the 16th century, and we don't really want to use your American Muppets. So we want to use our Muppets, and I want to see. That's kind of what they look like. So they did have a really rich puppetry tradition, and I was familiar with that, having gone to the Obraztsov Puppet Theater for years in Moscow. But the Muppets that were created by Jim Henson, were completely different. They were soft and cuddly and made out of foam, and of course, it represented change. And the head writer made the point that there's so much turmoil going on in children's lives now. They need things that are familiar. So we should really have our own puppets so they don't have to adjust. They already have so many other things to adjust to, as we've just had this revolution. So the next thing they did is they came to me and said, we want you to meet with our top puppet maker, Kolya Komov. So we all got together, and Kolya walks in with these 2 sacks. He pulls out 2 hand puppets, and he puts them on his arms, and then he picks up a stick, and one of the puppets starts beating the other puppet. And my whole team is laughing, and I'm just thinking, this doesn't look like Sesame Street. And I didn't find it funny at all. But then we really didn't have any flexibility. The puppets had to be Muppets because I was hired by Sesame Street, and we have a license agreement which is creating a Sesame Street style show. They don't incorporate other Muppets from the countries where they work. So then they said, okay, we'll come up with one of our own Muppets. I said, you can make it anything in your own tradition. Pull something out of your folklore. Base it on your own aesthetic sensibility. So they said, okay, we would like to base it on Domovoy, who is a spirit of the home. He's a spirit of nature, and he protects the hearth in the home. And I thought, well, that's a beautiful idea. That could be a great Muppet. And I'll show you what he looks like. So the earliest drawings that they did, the sketches, had this like hunched over old man who, his character was that he was very didactic and he was going to tell the kids how to behave. So I took the drawings back to the Henson Studios, and the chief designer there said, these are terrible. And he encouraged me to go back and ask them to try to come up with an idea that was more playful, more childlike. Wouldn't it make sense for the Muppet to be a child, not an old man, so that children could relate to him? So I did that, and I was part of this process. And it wasn't like I could go and just impose an idea. We worked very closely with our creative team to bring them along on this journey. So eventually, Domovoy was transformed into Zeliboba, and this is what he looks like. So he's a magnificent Muppet who is taller than Big Bird, And as you see, he is at one with nature because he has pieces of leaves, and he has leaves and moss and bark sewn into his coat. And on the set, the team insisted that he live inside a 40-foot tree. This tree had to be delivered from America on practically a C-131 aircraft. There were two other Muppets, were Kubik, hand puppet, Muppet, and Busika, who was the female Muppet.
Did they manage to make you, allow them to make a Baba Yaga?
No.
It was in your book, they were trying.
Oh, in the beginning, yes. The early part of this, they had suggested making, and you know, this is basically a character out of Russian literature, which is a witch who eats children. So I didn't think that was a good idea for Sesame Street. So these are some of the other shots from the set.
How long did you work there?
On this production,
Yeah.
5 years. Yeah, we started in 1993, and it took till 1996 when we first aired the first show, and then continued for 2 years.
When you had people come that you talked to, that maybe to hire, and they had such reservations that were flying in the face of what you wanted to do, did you expect that, having been in Russia before?
I didn't expect it. I mean, I think I had assumptions, as many of us did in the West, that the people who were progressive-minded would be closer to a lot of open ideas of the West. And I learned over time that, you know, expecting countries that had no experience with democracy to mirror our own was unrealistic, not only in Russia, but anywhere. And it takes a long, long time for ideas to change, for consciousness to change. And the making of Sesame Street was part of that, you know, movement along that, you know, that road to change. But it did take us quite a bit of time, and you know, that became very apparent in the curriculum seminar, which is where we come up with the educational goals for the TV show. You know, what is it that they want to teach their children of the next generation? And this is Russians, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians. The show was intended to be broadcast, and it was, on Russia's largest TV station across 11 time zones. So we had to be sensitive and inclusive in terms of bringing in the different nationality interests, as this country, the former Soviet Union, was falling apart, and all of the countries were becoming independent. So, but they were still receiving the TV channel in Russian from Moscow. So that was the period that we were in, and you know, we were experiencing this transition, and we thought the Muppets would be able to, you know, smooth the way towards this process. But in this curriculum seminar, for instance, it was held in the Danilov Monastery, which is the seat of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. And we just happened to rent rooms there to have this meeting. It was like a 3-day meeting. I thought that was incredibly cool, because it was like all the Russian Orthodox churches there, and the monks walking around, and here we were trying to create this new show, like create a whole new vision for another country. So I said to the research director who had organized everything, "This is such a great idea, you know, that you planned." And she said to me, "Oh, well, it was just that, you know, we got a good rate on the rooms." As I was waxing on about this. And then we invited educators from all over the former Soviet Union for these 3 days. And at first it was very difficult because, for instance, one physicist announced that he was going to be leaving that he didn't believe this was possible to come to any sort of agreement on what we would teach children. And he said, you know, you're asking us to create a show with educational goals that will teach children about an open society, but none of us have ever lived in an open society. So how are we supposed to know? And the research director from America, Charlotte Cole, who was a really amazing person, she said, just trust us. Stay here. Please don't leave. Just give us a chance. And the process in this, and I write about this in the book because it's so important to see how change happens in a country. How do you have groups of people that feel one way about something? And then how do they change their minds? And this is relevant for all societies, and especially for America right now, too. And in this case, you know, in the beginning, we were having discussions about how do you teach children what is a free market after you're coming from a command economy, for instance. And I thought, well, how do we do this in America? Well, children run lemonade stands. That's some of their early experiences with commerce of any kind. And when I proposed to the group that we create a scenario like this, they were horrified. And they said, you mean children selling things on the streets? I said, yeah. And they said, but the only people that do that are like mafia and criminals. And that was very true because we were only a couple of years out from where independent commerce was completely illegal and you could go to prison for speculation, which was basically the selling of things by independent people.
One of my really favorite Russian teachers I knew for a long time in Washington, D.C. and worked with, they emigrated, came under state Soviet Jewry with their one son, and that one son had 5 children eventually. And so Musia, the grandmother, she was mentoring them, and she came to me once in tears and said, my granddaughter said that they're setting up a lemonade stand at their house and they're going to sell lemonade. And she was just like looking at me like, isn't that terrible? And I said, Musia, that's what we do.
That's a great story. No, I love that.
In America.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a really hard thing for Russians to get over, including many other things when they come to another country. Hard to understand why the bank will charge you $50 when you bounce a check when they have given you a whole bag of checks in your purse. And come to me and say, your banks are terrible here.
Well, they didn't have a lot of banking experience.
They didn't have any.
Right.
Yeah, so I was wondering this, why did you have to be the one pursuing somebody to fund this enterprise of Muppets in Russia? Why were you looking for a donor yourself in the book?
Well, I was hired. I mean, I was just hired by the workshop, by Sesame Workshop.
Okay.
Yeah, and I mean, that was part of my job.
Yeah.
So I was trying to put, you know, I had that part of the job, and then I had assembling the team, and then we move on to the creative process, which was, you know, where I really wanted to be from the beginning, not doing the other stuff. But the, you know, what I learned along the way really helped me understand what the show had to be eventually. And I think, you know, the process of, you know, I think the curriculum seminar, which is really the cornerstone of every international production, is the greatest area of learning for us in the beginning. And you know, one poignant time was when we were talking about inclusivity, and we showed a video of a little boy in a wheelchair flying a kite, and this really upbeat song comes out that's, you know, me in my chair, we go everywhere, and it's a really sweet segment. And when I turn off the video, there's just like dead silence. And then one of the people says, "That's so exploitative to show children in wheelchairs." And that was not what I was, the reaction I was expecting. And then another woman says, "I don't understand why normal children, normalnie dzieci, would want to ever watch a TV show with nienormalnie dzieci, not normal children." And then someone else says, "We shouldn't show these children, any children in wheelchairs. Let them escape with the hell we live in, and have another vision." And then, I was really listening to this, worried that maybe they weren't ready for Sesame Street, and this is another example of where these were my assumptions about how far along on the trajectory towards openness my team was. But then this woman said, "What you Americans don't understand is that our medical system has just collapsed. And we have handicapped children," and she used the word crippled children, in beds, stuck in their beds, and they will never, ever get a wheelchair. So how will they feel if they see children with wheelchairs on our TV show? They'll just feel sad. So then, the group was thinking about that, and then this was a many-hour conversation, which was broken up by coffee breaks and a lunch and everything. And then later on in the afternoon, this woman who hadn't spoken the entire time raised her hand, and she said, "My name is Ludmila Chipurina, and I'm from Cheboksary, which is in the western region of Russia. And I work with these children in wheelchairs and children with disabilities every day. And they long to be seen as normal children and to play with normal children. And I think that we have a responsibility to introduce them into our show and present them as a valuable part of society. That is why we're here today." And after she spoke, I looked around, and half the people in the room were crying. And I was crying as well. And then the group together decided to write scenarios that would include children with disabilities in the show. And I hadn't uttered a word. And to me, that was an example of how change took place through this process.
So in the 1980s, early 80s, I took Jean Kennedy Smith, who was Ted Kennedy's sister, to Russia because she had a little nonprofit called Very Special Arts, and it dealt with children. And they had a disabled sister, the Kennedy kids. And she and her sister also have, worked on that all their lives. So we went around talking to newspapers because of who she was. She's a Kennedy. We asked to talk to people at Literary Gazette in, and although she got really mad at him because he wasn't agreeing with her, the new head of this newspaper, and she started arguing with him, and it didn't go very well because he was saying, "We don't do that. We still keep our people in buildings outside of all major cities. They don't get out. Why would we want to see them?" Mm-hmm. That sort of stuff in the early 80s. We were shocked. I was shocked because I'd been there before and I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. It's a deep-rooted feeling on their part.
But they did change, and the show was quite inclusive, and they included a lot of elements with other nationalities too. Many Ukrainian segments, which now, looking back, 30 years later, it's heartbreaking to see where we were then and where we are today. And I've been in touch with so many of these people on WhatsApp because I went back in January of 2020 and interviewed people, and then stayed in touch with them afterwards as the war broke out to find out what were they thinking. And so many of my colleagues were part of the first wave to leave after Putin cracked down on speaking out against his special operation on social media or protesting. So it's been very difficult, and so many people that are still there are not able to protest or speak freely because they're taking care of small kids or their older parents, and they don't want to go to prison for 15 years. And they've lived through these incredibly volatile periods in their history. I mean, I can't believe that I lived through personally the Soviet Union, this period of Renaissance when it opened, and then the closing of it again, and at each juncture filming in this, but it's not my country. I can leave.
I wanted to ask this question very quickly before it turns red. Anyway, you learned a lot about Russian people and their lives while working with them in Moscow. And can you talk to people here who haven't been to Russia about the resilience and the temperament of Russians? It's quite extraordinary, actually, when you meet them.
Well, I think the whole concept of friendship is very different. And because there's a public sphere, which is a repressive regime, and it was that way during the 1980s, my friends were mostly artists, mostly underground rock musicians, and people from the LGBTQ community. And we all had our own separate life from what was a public life that the state was involved in. And it was a safe space. And because you have this contrasting repressive regime, people must help each other to survive, even getting food, bringing food for each other. Somebody, there's a store which is called Milk. That's it. It doesn't have like the name like Dave's Grocery or something. It just says Milk. And there's another one that says Meat. So people would divide up, who's going to do what to get the food, because there were so many food shortages. This was in the 80s. And so the friendships that get made there are very, very deep, because you cannot rely on the society for assistance. The flip side of this is sometimes when friends of mine who were married came to America, they immediately got divorced. And I was like, why did you get divorced? You just arrived. And my girlfriend said, because I could. And I thought that was pretty funny. But a key part here is that, we in the West should never underestimate Russia's resilience and their capacity for suffering. So, you think about the policies that we take, for instance, in terms of sanctions, and they're only so successful because the Russian people are a very proud people. And many of the themes that we dealt with, even making this children's puppet show, like Russian pride, Russian nationalism, Russia's sense of the West trying to destroy Russia, imposing their own Muppets on us, they're a sense that they have a certain spiritual and cultural superiority. Well, they're a brilliant group of people, especially the intellectuals and artists who've made the most astounding contributions to the world. And these same people are there. Just recently, the State Department asked me to meet with 20 content creators from Moscow. And I thought, this is incredibly weird because we don't have a cultural exchange program with Russia right now. And this is probably the most isolated we have ever been since the Cold War. I mean, I cannot believe the level that we're at of lack of interaction. And because there were wars going on before that we were both involved in, but we still had communication. And friends of mine who work in the Defense Department have told me, they were able to pick up the phone when there was a crisis and have a conversation. That's not happening now, which is really dangerous with nuclear weapons. But this meeting, I was in Boston, and I didn't think it was exactly the State Department that was running this operation based on the people I was meeting and their sophistication and multiple languages. So I didn't think it would happen. And then I get a call 2 days before the event, and they arrive. And they say, we're sending a car for you. I'm like, I don't have an address. Where are you sending me? And they said, to the airport. And I thought, this doesn't sound good. So I had them give me an address, and it was actually the hotel next to the airport. And all of these young people came in, and I don't know this generation because Sesame Street aired for 10 years, and it was a huge hit across, multiple countries in the former Soviet Union. But this generation didn't grow up with it necessarily. So I was stunned to discover that they knew Zeli Boba, they knew the Muppets, that their parents had showed them the tapes, like videotapes. And at the same time, we talked about what it's like for them living in this repressive regime as content creators. They were given 3-year visas, and I'm sure some of them were FSB agents, and some of them weren't. And it's unclear to me, even after interviewing the State Department / CIA people I talked to, why we were doing this. Were they being recruited? What was going on? But I have to say that I've since then had continued conversations with them, and it is so difficult for them to navigate this. So I asked them, how are you handling being content creators? You have blogs, you have newspapers that you're writing for. Does anybody come to you and tell you what you can write or can't write? And basically they said, we self-censor. We know what we can write and not write. And I thought, how terrifying for that generation.
I think we should move to question and answer from the audience. We're getting to the top of the hour. But one question I had was, so how many total episodes were made of, and how do you say it in Russian? Is it Ulitsa Sezam?
Ulitsa Sezam.
Ulitsa Sezam. So how many episodes were made altogether?
So for the first season, which ran for 2 years, we made 52 half hours. So then they repeated during those 2 years. And then there were another subsequent 3 years of shows of a similar amount that were then repeated.
And then they were syndicated and played
all throughout the former Soviet Union.
For 10 years, and then they were pulled from the air?
They were pulled from the air in 2010. And basically it was that they, probably related to Putin's crackdown on independent media, and there was a grab for the show. The TV station was very much controlled at that point by executives who were loyal to the regime, and they fired the director of research.
Okay. Is there questions? So here, one's from the audience.
Do I do it like that? Okay. I was wondering about the street itself. Were there stoops? Who were the human characters? Were there human characters who interacted with the puppets? And did they hang out? Was there a grocer and blah, blah, blah?
So there's a great question. I mean, it's a fabulous set. And in addition to the scrim, the backdrop here, the artistic director wasn't sure what she should make, in terms of the set. And should it reflect what period of Russia? So that's where she made this. It reflects all the periods of Russia. So pre-revolutionary Russia, the Soviet period with the Khrushchev, buildings, made out of concrete, the Stalinist architecture, and as well as the rural elements too. They were very keen on making sure that the set was appealing to people living in the countryside. So that was the basic, and then the buildings, the structures on the set also reflected the different architectural periods of Russian history. And as far as the family, and there's a lot more about this in the book, so I hope you read it, but there's they picked a nuclear family, and there was extensive discussion on this, like about what type of family should it be, very similar to the early days of Sesame Street around alternative families, and the conversations were fascinating, because it really looks at by focusing on a nation's children, it's one of the most intimate ways to understand what people think and what are their dreams for their future, for their children and for their country.
Okay, other questions?
What differences in Russian culture did you observe that you think Americans are not aware of?
Well, there were many, but I think maybe one of the best ways to convey this is to tell a particular story about a script that was submitted where the educational goal was to teach children the difference between happy and sad. And this particular segment showed a little boy and a little girl who were walking in a park, and they were each holding a balloon. And the little boy lets go of his balloon, and he looks very sad. And then the little girl looks at him, and she lets go of her balloon. And the two of them watch the balloons go up into the clear blue sky, holding hands and smiling. And when I saw this script, I looked at my team. I was with all the writers, and I go, why don't they just share the other balloon? And they just laughed at me because it was such an American interpretation. They said, no, they are happy. They are happy enjoying the beauty of the sky. And I didn't say anything, but I did with my closer friends later, and I said, yes, they were both very happy together with nothing. And that was my perspective. But the script was made that way, and it reflected a certain characteristic, which I understand. And there's this whole idea of suffering, and there's beauty in suffering, and capturing that for a preschooler is pretty phenomenal in a little script. So, that was one example.
Other questions? Yeah.
There seemed to be all those assassinations and car bombings at the outset. Did they suddenly cease, and why?
So I think after the third partner was assassinated, we just gave up. And I said, okay, I convinced the workshop to move forward with our partner, but no broadcaster. So we actually made the entire show without having a broadcaster. And it was only at the very end, in 1996, after Yeltsin won the re-election as the Russian president, that we were able to conclude a broadcast deal. So the entire time we had no broadcaster, and we had no oversight. It was pretty wild. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you to Deborah and to you, Natasha, for a really illuminating conversation tonight, looking not only at the Muppets and how that show came to be in Russia, but also about Russian culture and how it applies to today. It was a really great, wide-ranging conversation. And so we're going to go to the portion of the evening where there's a book signing. So let's give a round of applause for our guests.